Welcome to this talk on India and the SDGs. Like China, India has also received considerable attention in recent decades in terms of its ability to reduce poverty, promote development. It has witnessed major economic growth, is considered to be a major world power. A lot of people talk about how India is emerging. Many others would claim India, like China, has already emerged. Now, in terms of sustainable development, India has a long history actually in enacting legislation on environmental issues. Um, India has considerable experience in addressing major natural disasters like droughts and floods. India has also been at the forefront of major environmental campaigns. However, the interest in sustainable development appears to be much more recent in the sense that ever since the 2030 agenda was adopted by world leaders in 2015 in New York, the Indian political leadership has been prioritizing it at all levels. Looking at pictures that I've taken from New Delhi, India's capital, which is known to be highly polluted. It has received, or it has become notorious in many ways for high levels of pollution, despite what you see here in terms of greenery. So there is a permanent smog, which is particularly bad during the winters. And the Indian public has been, for many years, requesting, demanding much more stringent attention in terms of the kind of pollution that a lot of Indians have become accustomed to. So, for example, in terms of demands for less air pollution, but there have also been major successful cases of people protesting to combat water pollution and other forms of pollution, including noise pollution. So, the Oslo SDG initiative has, together with Jawaharlal Nehru University, undertaken certain events. For example, we did a workshop recently, well, in October 2018, where we actually discussed what does sustainable development mean in India now, and how the SDGs are being implemented in an Indian context. I've also been studying India for many years and interacting with policymakers, civil society organizations, but regular citizens at all levels. And I find it particularly interesting that India has been actively promoting the SDGs and the wider sustainable development agenda in general. So, what is India's position in terms of sustainable development? It turns out that in many policy documents that Indian agencies, think tanks, ministries have been formulating and publishing in recent years, there's been considerable focus on this idea that you have to have inclusive growth. The Indian government is going to prioritize inclusive growth, but it can only be done through collective effort. So the vision that the Prime Minister has been articulating is that collective effort is the way towards promoting inclusive growth. Like China, India has also expressed strong support for the common but differentiated responsibilities principle. India is very concerned that it has not reached the level of development that many other countries have, and that the key to reducing poverty is economic growth, which also then means that India can't take on, at least according to the authorities, the same kind of burdens in terms of environmental regulation, in terms of pollution control, etc., that more affluent countries are undertaking at the moment. One of the biggest assets that India has is the history or the lessons it has learned from a long history of implementing major social protection programs. Some of the most expensive, some of the largest social protection programs in the world related to nutrition, unemployment, etc., have been taking place in India. So what India has done in terms of articulating its SDG policy is to basically say that it is trying to revamp, redirect, reorient some of these ambitious programs, and these are now directly linked to the SDGs. And an important strategy, of course, given the enormously large population that India has been to focus on unemployment, particularly in the agricultural sector, but also in infrastructure, and generally strategies that promote improve livelihood opportunities for rural as well as urban residents. The Prime Minister has often highlighted the fact that if India can achieve or make certain progress on certain indicators, if India can achieve certain SDGs, if India can implement certain development programs successfully, then it would be important for the whole world. And so this quote in many ways illustrates that kind of focus. He says, just as our vision behind Agenda 2030 is lofty, our goals are comprehensive. It gives priority to the problems that have endured through the past decades, and it reflects our evolving understanding of the social, economic, and environmental linkages that define our lives. The sustainable development of 1/6 of humanity will be of great consequence to the world and our beautiful planet. So in many ways, India appears to be aware of its responsibility, having the kind of population that it does, that any success India achieves will have important implications for the rest of the world. In terms of implementing this ambitious new drive that focuses on sustainable development, India has in recent years used a government think tank called Niti Aayog. Niti stands for the National Institution for Transforming India. It has now been spearheading the movement for sustainable development by involving national level ministries, but also state and local level governments. You have considerable discourse in India at the moment about how politicized this government think tank is. The opposition often claims that this think tank, NITI, is basically a mouthpiece for the ruling party, but nonetheless, in terms of overarching policy directions on sustainable development, NITI has been the one taking the lead. And the strategy that NITI has focused reflects some of the thinking, of course, that the Prime Minister has been articulating, that there are all of these ambitious social protection programs that focus on nutrition and health, they focus on certain groups of the population, like the girl child, that focus on unemployment and more generation of employment. And these have to be scaled up, and India can only achieve sustainable development if it builds on this kind of success. And so the head of Niti Aayog, the government think tank, says the common theme of these programs is this idea that development is for all. It has to be inclusive, but most importantly, the idea of Agenda 2030 and the SDGs has actually or must be mainstreamed in India's development strategy. So in other words, sustainable development cannot be seen in isolation from everything else that India is currently undertaking. So in coming up with the kind of strategy that India has on sustainable development, like some countries, it actually went ahead and formulated a national action plan. And the idea behind the action plan is interesting in the sense that India is a very large country with a federal government, a union government in New Delhi, but also numerous state governments or provincial governments spread across. Now, one of the things that India has, I suppose, cleverly undertaken is this kind of policy on competitive federalism, is making these regional governments or state governments compete with each other in terms of achieving the SDGs. So the approach has in many ways resembled a naming and shaming approach that the think tank NITI, the government of India, and through numerous reports, there's this focus on highlighting the successes of states, but also some of the challenges. The strategy has also entailed issuing regular guidelines, progress reports. There have been attempts at measuring success, measuring indicators, developing new indicators depending on available data. There's been, as I have mentioned earlier, much more of a focus on building on existing social protection programs, but also aligning any new initiative on sustainable development with existing national plans. An interesting feature has also been to implement things at the local levels, to get state governments to show greater ownership and responsibility, and then to somehow distill this to lower levels. A big challenge that comes to the forefront in many of the discussions I've had with Indian policymakers and also civil society activists is the availability of data. There's still this feeling that India does not have enough data, does not have good quality data that would allow for reliable measurements of the SDGs and the different indicators, and thereby reporting on progress and challenges. So a big concern in many of the discussions I have in India is related to how one can effectively, reliably monitor success, achievements, challenges, whatever, at national and state levels. So what then are the policy priorities? In some of the documents that India has released in UN contexts, in terms of reporting at the United Nations, India has highlighted several programs that are or a claim to be closely aligned to the SDGs. SDG 1, for example, India highlights housing and education, drinking water, cooking gas to poor families, and similarly in terms of SDG 2 on no hunger, there's a focus on subsidized food through existing major social protection programs like the ICDS, which is the Integrated Child Development Services Program, the Midday School Meal Program, all kinds of existing initiatives, according to the Indian government, have been tailor-made to achieve SDG 2 and SDG 3, and on all the remaining SDGs for that matter. An important initiative India launched a couple of years ago has to do with this very ambitious health insurance program. There's been considerable talk about covering large groups of the Indian population, but there's also been criticism about India's ability to do so effectively and also to fund the enormous costs of covering this kind of large population with a health insurance policy. There's been considerable focus, unlike many countries which I suppose have not really discussed the need to generate new financing for sustainable development. India has undertaken a major tax reform with the aim of generating greater resources so that the state, both at the national and at the regional levels, has adequate resources to follow through on these policy priorities.